fight for tomorrow, we have to also think about the impacts today. And therein lies the challenge. But the challenge that my community partners and my community leaders are up for.
The words of Mayor Bruce Harrell there, touting a Green New Deal, where the city plans to invest $6.5 million this year for environmentally sound projects, some job creation too. But that spending plan, just the tip of the iceberg as the city prepares for the mayor's full budget presentation this week. What's the plan for investing in police? Where will money from the jumpstart tax on big businesses go? Plus, what's happening with a big pushback in the Chinatown-ID over an expansion of a homeless shelter there? And what's the story behind a major ballot measure in King County for mental and behavioral health? Well, all these questions and so much more this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. We will try to provide some answers here. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel, and the views expressed here are my own. I am joined by David Croman from the Seattle Times. And David, I try not to start arguments as a rule, but I think I saw you tweet the other day that Deep Impact was the superior asteroid movie of the 1990s. Are you saying you just never watched Armageddon? What's going on, man?
No, I watched Armageddon. I mean, I haven't seen any of them since the 90s, so
That's a good point. Nor
I
have
have
I.
a feeling they're both probably not that good.
Terrible.
But actually, no, I did try and rewatch Armageddon like maybe 5-7 years ago, and I couldn't make it through the first like half hour. It was it's pretty bad. I was just thinking about it because of the satellite crashing into the asteroid.
Yeah,
a lot of Armageddon comparisons, but I feel like we should be making Deep Impact.
There we go. I love it. And Bruce Willis, if you are listening to this podcast, I'll give it another watch and see if I can make it through. David, thank you as always for joining me. Thanks to our listeners too. A lot of you out there, we appreciate you tuning in here to the podcast. Thanks to City Grind Espresso, our background noise sponsor for the audio podcast on the first floor of City Hall. Make sure you check them out. Thanks also to our patrons. We would love to have more listeners support the show. If you can make it happen at the $10 level, what a treat that would be. A Seattle News, Views, and Brews mug would be headed your way, and you can join the elite mug club of the show. Plus, we will feature your photo on our mugshot of the week. This week, a big shout out to Lily. Her mugshot with the bubbles in the background. Definitely the best one we got in this summer. Thanks for helping out the show, Lily. Thanks to all the rest of y'all. Please become a patron if you're not already. That's Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Finally, thank you to Converge Media. The video version of the podcast airs on Converge Wednesday evenings at 7. All right, let's get the party rolling with right here, right now. Okay, so it's city budget time, and we are releasing this podcast just a short while before the mayor offers his budget proposal to the city council. And David, I'm very interested, as is the rest of the world, on what the mayor plans to present when it comes to a police department budget. Marcus Harrison Green, I thought, had a terrific editorial in the Seattle Times talking about this recently. The section that really hit me was this. I'll draw out a quote. "We repeatedly awaken to a backlash over the defund the police slogan, but see no real structural changes to the institution of law enforcement, such as increased transparency on use of force, nor do we see drastic reallocations from it." So Marcus, in his piece there, was predicting a significant investment in the STD, which is definitely trying to grow its numbers, a 30-year low in staffing. And David, I just want to get your thoughts on this. Has there been so much focus on steering away from the defund police narrative that we've lost sight of why this phrase came into being in the first place following the murder of George Floyd?
Yeah, I do think that's a good point. And yeah, I mean, there's not, some of the tenets of those protests were around not just reform, but, an argument that the basic fundamentals and foundation of law enforcement was flawed and therefore should be torn down and something rebuilt in its place. We even Council President Deborah Juarez, who, is very vocal about the fact that she never signed on to the 50% pledge. Even she was, I think, had a quote talking about how, it's not just a bad apple, the whole tree is rotten. So, this was a widely shared belief at the time. And I think that Marcus is right that while there are still conversations around, alternatives to policing and, mental health response and all that kind of thing, that there is, you do not hear conversations any longer about fundamental, deconstruction and rebuilding of what law enforcement looks like. I think that he's very much right that any momentum on that has stalled or stopped.
Yeah. It's going to be an interesting, an interesting discussion when it comes to police budget numbers there. But I'm just looking at the raw numbers here, David, and the reality is we're in this $141 million hole. The city of Seattle is as of the city's August forecast here. The council and the mayor, the current mayor at least, lay a lot of that at the feet of former Mayor Durkin. He used a lot of one-time funding for some projects the city really wants to continue in terms of equitable development and other priorities. And filling that gap, at least part of it, I'm coming around here, is going to come from the jumpstart tax on big business. So, again, just a background here, folks. This is a measure intended to invest in affordable housing and Green New Deal projects. It was directed, at least portions of it, large portions of it, was directed to filling general fund budget holes last year and the year before. And this year, Council Budget Chair Teresa Mosqueda, who authored the legislation, has said, okay, excess revenue from Jumpstart, the money above and beyond what it was supposed to bring in, using that to plug the budget hole, that makes sense. But she says, I don't want the mayor to raid Jumpstart. She's saying, don't give us an austerity budget. And my question is, how does the mayor walk that fine line? He definitely has his eyes on those Jumpstart dollars.
Yeah, we'll see how he walks that line. I think, in advance of the budget announcement, we're hearing from, his people in his office talking about how this budget is going to focus on fundamentals, the basic services. They're hosting a press conference today at noon in, I think, like a pretty nondescript city building,
Right.
of the Chinatown International District. So, all of that, when I hear we're going to focus on fundamentals and basic city services, that tells me we're not making any big, huge, splashy announcement of some program we're funding. We're just going to spend the money we have and say that we're going to do it really well. And so I think that's a sign that, I don't think he's going to shoot for the moon on this budget, or I would be surprised. But I would imagine, sort of like Mayor Durkin did before, there's probably going to be a bit of push and pull around the Jumpstart. He's probably going to want to use more of it than maybe Councilmember Mosqueda would want for those basic city services.
Right.
I would imagine that'll be kind of a debate back and forth. That said, I think even the fact that Councilmember Mosqueda has sort of signaled her openness and willingness to spend this money on to fill that gap is a, I would say those two sides are probably already closer than they were in past budget seasons.
That's a good point. And I'm also very interested to see what Councilmember Mosqueda is going to do with that excess money that I know is going to be in the SPD budget, because they have not met their hiring goals this year. So those excess salaries that they were planning for there, what does happen to that extra money? There was a big battle over that last year. We'll see where that goes here. But I guess just looking forward with this, I think there are some structural problems involved here too, because the mayor's staff has actually told a number of departments, okay, present a budget that has a 3 to 6% cut. And so maybe that's not austerity, but he's definitely asking all these departments to try to figure out how to do with less. And I'm just looking at these different budget numbers, and there's a predicted shortfall this year and next year and through the year 2026 of about $140 million. So I guess the bottom line for me, David, is there's going to be some tough choices ahead. And I think that's going to be reflected in this year's budget too.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know that necessarily means layoffs, but you could see that you could imagine a scenario where jobs go unfilled. Things don't roll over as much as they used to.
Right.
But again, his message so far around, we're going to invest in basic city services. I think, I would be surprised if he makes cuts to things like, road crews or something.
Right. Yeah.
But I do think maybe some of these programs that have been stood up over the last few years, that these kind of, yearly one-time programs, maybe they lose a person or two if it comes to that. And it'll be interesting. I think, I remember at the early part of the pandemic, I think Mayor Durkin also told the departments to
make those kind of cuts or prepare for them.
They never had to do it, as far as I know.
Right.
But they should be, they've gone through this drill before. They should have something kind of prepared. And I don't know that it'll be that big of a leap for them to kind of dust off those plans a little bit.
Right.
I don't know what that means as far as what people see day to day. Maybe, shorter hours on community centers.
Sure.
Shorter hours in libraries. I don't know what it'll be, but maybe little things like that.
Yeah, yeah. It's going to be interesting to see how they tie these different pieces together. And thank you for that breakdown there, David. Just looking at that and a lot happening over the next several weeks. But behind all the budget talk, some very interesting movement this week on the Police Department's risk management demand analysis. So it's a clunky name, but the point here is SPD is trying to figure out how to manage 911 calls that are coming in and change the response for low priority calls so that armed officers aren't heading out to every scene. This is a follow up to what the council often calls the Nick Jr. report, the National Institute of Criminal Justice, which analyzed how a call was classified when it came in. So, this new report from the SPD shows how the call was resolved. They studied just about 350 of these calls coming in. And when these calls are resolved, that can actually be different than original classification. I looked into this, David, and looking at this report, I thought it was very interesting. So, the cops broke down about 350 some odd different call types that came in, from shots fired to reporting parking violations. They found out that 46% of the calls did not escalate beyond the usual police response. 23% could be downgraded into lower priority calls, and about 31% had to be upgraded into a higher priority call. And I guess, David, we've touched on this before, but the challenge is, how do you build a new system off of that? A lot of cities I know are trying to do this, but where do you start? Do you train the 911 call takers in a different way? Do you retrain officers on how to downgrade calls? Any ideas on what this could look like?
Yeah, I think a lot of it, my sense is a lot of this will fall on dispatchers, which is
Yeah.
challenging, of course. Because yeah, as we've talked about, it is one thing to sort of look retroactively at calls and say, this number didn't need this kind of response, but knowing that in real time presents challenges. I know that Chief Diaz, in a story in my paper recently, said that he thinks the number is lower than what other reports have come out about
Yeah.
what would require police response. And then, I think for police, probably their worst case scenario is they conclude that something does not need a police response, and then it escalates to something, and something,
Right.
Somebody gets hurt. And so
Right.
sort of
Right.
covering your bases on all of those is really challenging. And from the time that I used to spend with police in these sort of situations, the challenge is just really around communication. They're open to, my sense is they're open to not responding to a lot of the calls that they do respond to, because it's frustrating for them too when they show up and it's they don't need to be there. But hearing the dispatch, interpreting the dispatch, communicating back to dispatchers what they're seeing, all through all those steps to sort of make clear that police didn't need to be there. That's really the challenge there. I still don't totally know how you do that efficiently, effectively.
Right. And again, this is a nationwide issue. A lot of different cities are trying this, but this is kind of getting built from the ground up. One final point on this briefly here, David. I know the council's pointed out in the past that not all the calls require an armed officer. I think you're right in saying the SPD would agree with that. But this whole idea of starting up some sort of pilot program on the with an alternative response here, I just remember the debacle that you wrote about splitting out parking enforcement officers from the SPD. They didn't have the ticket writing authority. You remember David writing about this, hundreds of thousands of tickets canceled. I just have to think the council is going to be very careful when it comes to building a new public safety system, building even a pilot here. It has to have a lot of public trust in that system. That's going to be a crucial piece of this.
Yeah, definitely. And the stakes on a parking ticket are pretty low in the grand scheme of things, but the stakes on some other public safety responses are a little bit higher.
Of course.
Actually, another thing that you just made me think of was in that same story, Chief Diaz. It was interesting. I think when a lot of people talk about alternative response, they imagine somebody other than police showing up. He seemed to be talking more about sort of co-response.
Yes, that's
which I imagine that some people would not agree with and find problems with that. But in the grand scheme, I think you can see why maybe the chief of police is saying that, because it's a bit easier and there's precedent for that. They already do that to a certain extent. There are mental health calls and things like that that do go with social workers, people from downtown emergency service center that work with police and actually respond with them. So it's a model that I think is more easily expanded. But anytime you're kind of anytime you're setting up a new department, anytime you're kind of creating a new arm of bureaucracy, a new government, it gets really challenging. I mean, there's the normal setup challenges of implementation. There's, of course, unions, which are tricky to negotiate with. And that was, I think, part of the one thing that kind of went haywire with the parking enforcement is the unions and the departments weren't really on the same page together. So yeah, it's easier said than done to set up a new department.
Yeah, no, a tricky one ahead. So I wanted to make sure we moved on because we got a big one up next here, folks. King County is planning to expand a homeless shelter in the Chinatown-ID. Only problem is a number of residents there say they were never part of the discussion about it. What's going on? We're going to tackle this coming up on Now Hear This. All right, well, last week, you might have seen this, a number of protesters descended on Seattle City Hall, pushing back against a plan from King County to expand a shelter for homeless people in the North Soto neighborhood, just on the border of Chinatown-ID there. This plan has been in the works for some time, but a number of residents say the outreach has been too little, too late. One person who says he's been doing business in Chinatown for 30 years had this to say at last week's city council meeting.
I am horrified to learn that the government is going to put together a problematic shelter campsite very close to Chinatown.
So looking at this, we're talking about a facility that would be a hub for social services, 419 beds, room for RVs, tiny homes, mental health, addiction treatment there at a cost of $66.5 million, mainly paid for with American Rescue Plan money. And David, protesters here are saying they haven't been listened to. They call this systematic racism. The council, the county council, that is, says we met back in May about this, spoke with the Neighborhood Police Public Safety Council in July about this. We're trying to get people inside. Are you concerned that concentrating so many services, so many shelter beds in one neighborhood like the Chinatown-ID will create more problems of crime and drug use, etc.? That's what the protesters are saying.
Yeah, that's always a tricky question. I mean, when you look at certain statistics around when there's tiny home villages or shelters, you don't immediately see, there's certainly no conclusive evidence that shows that is the case. It's been a hard year for a few years for the Chinatown International District. They have, of course, the pandemic and a lot of the food industry there was shut down, and then they've had public safety concerns for a while. There is a lot of homelessness in the Chinatown International District. So, you can understand that it's a kind of tired and frustrated community.
Right. Then throw light rail location on top of that too. But yeah, keep going.
Yeah, of course. At the same time, these shelters, they try and build these shelters and these points of contact near where people will actually use them. And there's certainly we could have a long discussion about inequities. Why isn't there a homeless shelter in Magnolia or Laurelhurst? Of course. Right. As things stand, if you're looking for sort of the quickest way to serve the most people, you do, government officials tend to want to put them where those people are. And
that's right.
That happens to be more in Soto and downtown and Pioneer Square and the Chinatown International District. So
right.
This is always, we see this whenever there are new services or new shelters that come into play, where people say, they're in principle in favor of new services and new places to stay. Right. But when it's near where they live, things get a little hairier. And I think that's kind of what's happening here. It just also happens that there's a lot more complexity maybe wrapped up in this particular community because of its history and because it's lower income and immigrant. But it's like I said, we see these sorts of conflicts on repeat basically whenever there are new shelters that are stood up.
And interesting to me to see the Seattle Police Officers Guild sticking their neck into this one too, siding with some of these protesters. That was very interesting to me.
And I think I don't remember if it was Washington State or King County Republicans.
That's right.
Also,
So,
I mean, whenever there are conflicts like this, I'm not out there reporting. What I would ask is, where?
That's right. If not here, then where?
Because it is clear that the city and the county needs more of this kind of shelter. I don't know that anyone argues with that. It's just whenever, like I said, it just always gets a lot more tricky when you say, okay, you think we need more shelter, we're going to put it here, we're going to put it kind of near where you live. Suddenly people don't are not quite as open to that as maybe they would have been in theory.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm not going to say it's not complicated, but it's a service that the county needs, and where that goes is
Right.
it's not easy.
This is the big question always with situations like this. I know the county at least is saying, the question shouldn't be, is this area the perfect location, the perfect kind of shelter there, but what's the alternative? And
Yeah.
that's more people on the street. So certainly something that will continue to be brewing there at the county level there, and we'll see it happens over the next couple of weeks. But I wanted to move on to another issue here. You thought it was difficult to find a place for a homeless shelter. How about a place for mental and behavioral health, some sort of facility of this nature? Well, Executive Dow Constantine pushing for a ballot measure coming up in April of next year to raise as much as $1.25 billion to build 5 regional mental health crisis centers. And David, your colleague, Esme Jimenez, wrote about this. Your reaction to what the county is proposing here?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because in some ways this is kind of a put your money where your mouth is moment, because if there's one thing that we hear from almost every political persuasion, doesn't matter, is mental health, mental health, mental health.
Yep.
The state is among the worst in investing in, their mental health system is among the worst in the country. And I mean, for as tense as debates are around homelessness and police response and criminal justice, the thing that we hear from both the left and the right is these people need more help, mental health treatment. They need more. There needs to be more help for these people. And so now here's the opportunity to do that. The thing is, the thing that stood out to me is, so I think the proposal was going to have 5 mental health facilities, I suppose, and
yes,
some, if not all of them, are supposed to be kind of places you could walk up to if you needed it.
That's
kind of
right.
walk-up clinics. And so then, that truly, you can't put a walk-up clinic in, in a place where there is no people. I mean,
That's right.
Has to be where those people are. And so
That's
then
right.
you get the same thing of, all right, we all say we support more mental health services and we want more mental health services available. We're going to have to put that somewhere. Are those same people going to be as supportive of that when it actually gets built? That's going to be, I think, for my money, the trickiest part of this whole thing, assuming it passes. Maybe it won't pass, but I would think, it's a lot of money. That's a big levy in the scheme of things. That said, like I said, that if there's one thing that we hear basically from everybody when it comes to homelessness and low-level crime and things like that is, these people need more mental health support. So
here we go. Right. And it's interesting. I'll get back to the money piece in a minute, but I think there are some different communities. I saw Esme writing about some of the areas north of Seattle shoreline, et cetera, where there are some cities that are trying to band together and do this very thing and build these different regional centers. And really, when I think it was 2018, when Governor Inslee was talking about, all right, we're decentralizing, we're not going with the old Western State Hospital model. We need to have these things in the areas where people are and take care of folks. This is the culmination of that 4 or 5 years later. And so I'm interested to see how that plays out. And also, when you talk about the dollars, I think this is a very important piece of this. It's not just the facilities they're working on trying to provide some higher wages to people who do these jobs, because during the pandemic, yes, we've really needed these services. I think everybody could agree with that. But also during the pandemic, people have been leaving this profession in droves. Psychiatrists, people who work with mental and behavioral health. I think that's an important piece of this as well.
Yeah, these are really hard jobs and they pay really badly. And so, you get this thing where you get 23-year-olds, 24-year-olds out of college who mean well, but they're inexperienced and they do it for a couple of years, or at most they don't make a lot of money. They get burnt out and they move on. How do you slow that churn? I mean, I think having continuity is really important in this. And so, I think it's harder to make the argument for those kinds of investments because people don't see it as much.
Right.
But you talk to any service provider in the world, I would imagine, and they're going to put this right at the top of issues, which is we just can't hang on to people because we're not paying them as much as they deserve for the sort of really challenging work they're doing.
Yeah, very challenging stuff. And it's going to be challenging in terms of dollars and cents, too. I don't want to overlook that. This is a measure that would cost about $121 per year for the average homeowner. And there are a lot of different issues on the ballot coming up with property taxes attached to them over the next couple months. So definitely keeping an eye on that, too. All right, up next, back to 3rd Avenue. What's it going to take to reimagine this roadway that serves such a crucial need for transit in our region? We got the details on Transportation Talk. David, you recently did a follow-up on the 3rd Avenue Vision story we've been talking about. The council actually approving this resolution this week to explore ways to make it not just for buses to move through on 3rd Ave, but for businesses too. What did you learn in putting together this story? Where do you see the city and the business community going on this?
Yeah, it's, I think, I mean, the first question is, will this conversation actually go anywhere? We'll see. I don't think I think this comes up every now and then, which is how do we kind of reshape 3rd Avenue? What's interesting to me about it, though, is its pitch is one that I think is more appealing to some kind of progressives in the city, which is we're not talking just about throwing more cops down there. We're talking about a way to sort of quote activate that space,
Activate
and do
space,
it in a
right?
more kind of holistic and sustainable way. And so the idea is you can maybe we change that corridor so that there's still the same number of bus traffic, but we do it with fewer buses somehow. We kind of widen the sidewalks, so we just basically do whatever we can to make it a place that people actually want to stay rather than leave. Because right now, 3rd Avenue is a really effective bus corridor, and it's at least right now basically only that, which is you go there to get a bus to leave there. There's not a lot of incentive to stay at 3rd Avenue, and so the question is, what will it take to create that incentive for people to stay there? And so this kind of process, which I imagine will be long and probably expensive, is what can be done to make that a place that people actually want to stay and therefore feel more vibrant and therefore create less opportunity for some of the disorder and activity that is not as desirable to flourish.
I will point out, I'm talking with Councilmember Herbold and Councilmember Mosqueda on the Council Edition show this month. It's coming out in a couple days on Seattle Channel. I was interested in talking to them about this because they really want to try to change the narrative, if you will, over transit is bad. Like it attracts all these different problems. They're trying to say, well, we need to celebrate that and we need to preserve this throughway of transit here. And so I don't know if I think they're trying to approach it from a both and is that a possibility to try to preserve the amount of bus traffic that goes through there and also make sure the businesses are taken care of?
Yeah, I think that's an important nuance, which is that I think the council is trying to strike, which is in their resolution they explicitly said we want to preserve the amount of transit that's coming through there. So it's not an argument that the buses themselves or the transit itself is the problem here. It's that the area around that has not been invested in any sort of meaningful way. So how do you keep basically that area as a transit corridor, make it efficient and effective for people to take the bus there, while also kind of rebuilding and rethinking the space around it? That's the kind of balancing act. I don't think that there's appetite there to, not have that same level of transit going through 3rd Avenue.
Right. And this idea of maybe introducing cars back on there, that feels like a non-starter to the council. I know I heard that. And just this idea of making sure that businesses are coming back. I look forward to this, David. I heard from Mosqueda and Herbold that they really want to get together some, wait for it, stakeholder meetings. So you're going to see a bunch of groups out there, including the DSA and others, getting together to try to figure this thing out. So I think it's important to start this conversation. I appreciated the piece you put together on this, but we got to wrap up the show. And I got to tell you, folks, it's playoff madness for the Mariners. I am finding it too tough to watch the games a lot of times. David, my question is this. Can the M's pull it together? Where is that silver lining I can find after such a demoralizing loss to Kansas City over the weekend where the relief pitchers gave up 11 runs in an inning? Help me. What do you got for me, man? Give me some good news.
I think the only silver lining is if they can turn it around, then and Julio comes back and Eugenio Suarez comes back,
Yes.
then you've actually had your bench players play some time, put some time in. They've got some game experience. Your bench is a little deeper. Suddenly, Jaron Kelnick is looking okay, which is an opportunity he would not have had there not been injuries. So, if they can turn it around and they can get healthy by the playoffs, I think they would be in a good position to rebound from this because, then they're healthy again and their bench players have gotten some playing time. But the key part of that is they still have to make the playoffs.
They still got to get through. We got a couple more weeks of nail biting to do here. But David, thank you. That was a very good point, and I'm glad you're on my side, man. As always, good stuff as always. Thank you, David, for joining me. Thanks everybody for listening out there to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. This podcast available on all the major platforms. And once again, if you do listen to the show, please support the show on Patreon. We couldn't do it without you. Thanks for watching on Converge Media too. We'll see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2022.